Nice to see you.
When we met General Oren, I met her when I went over with the delegation. She was a young general then, and I didn't want to miss her.
Terrific. She's still young.
No, she is. She is. No, she was young then. Yeah, come on. Nice to meet you. Yousef. I'm glad you could come. Both of you.
Did we determine the speaking order?
No, I spoke to speak.
So I guess we'll just wait to hear our name called
Order in which they are.
and scream out bingo.
Okay. I don't need these, do I? Up here. Are we going to hand them to the speakers, one on each side? I've only got two over here, so it doesn't matter.
Extra mic for the Q&A session.
Do you want us to do remarks from up
I
there?
would like every speech from the
From the
podium, but
podium?
we can do Q&A from the seats if you're more comfortable.
As you wish.
Are we ready?
Yeah, why not?
Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started now, and I'd like to welcome you to our new venue for the day. Do I need to tell you that the government is closed down? We lost our normal venue. That's the only impact that I can tell that Congress has had on us in a long time. In the audience, we have a live stream audience, and we have some online watching it, and then those of you that are here in person. For those of you that want to send in questions, you have cards on your seats. You just hold them up. Someone will bring them up. And Dr. Munayyer will take the questions, and at the question time, we'll go through those. For those of you online that want to submit questions, just submit them at Mideast Policy, and we'll get them. I want to acknowledge a number of guests in the audience. Is Ambassador Muhammad al-Husseini al-Sharifi here? I don't know if he made it, but he did RSVP. We also have members of the Hasib Sabak Foundation, which are some of our benefactors, and Suhail Sabak is here, and we're glad to have you here. We welcome you, but there's a special designation for pointing out the Hasib Sabak Foundation's presence here. Hasib Sabak has long been a supporter of a negotiated settlement in the Middle East. He never took what you would consider to be a radical approach to anything in the Middle East. He was a very generous donor to chairs at universities, foundations. He promoted within the Palestinian community a peaceful resolution to the conflict. So we're always honored to be associated and affiliated with the Hasib Sabak Foundation. The Middle East Policy Council is an American nonprofit organization. We were established in 1981. The purpose is to examine issues that affect American interests in the Middle East. We do this through three major programs: a quarterly journal, which not only do we consider it the best journal on Middle East policy in print, but it's in its about 117th series, over 1,300 articles, 500 book reviews. It's been going for the whole time of our 30-some-odd years since '81 as the finest journal on policy. You don't get a lot of theory and a lot of history here. You get policy analysis here. And it's a well-written journal. Second, we convene Hill conferences. This is our 74th since 1993. And third, we do a lot of work with organizations that do outreach to the schools, colleges, and other places around the country. Today, we're talking about the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, it's not new to any of you in this room. As a matter of fact, it's about 65 years old for those of you that want to not deal with the Bible. Just roughly about 15,000 Israelis have died in the Arab-Israeli conflict, and about 55,000 Palestinians, rough numbers, and countless lives destroyed on both sides over this conflict. And the stakes are really high. It's a pile of rocks called the Holy Land. I call it modern-day idolatry. And it doesn't seem to abate. Today we want to examine the unresolved conflict that many, including the President of the United States, Commander-in-Chief, generals, policy analysts say that the national interests of America are dramatically affected because we keep pushing this problem down the road further and don't seem to have enough backbone to do what needs to be done. Today, we want to explore the solution that has been pursued in the past for 2 decades and see if it's still any chance of success, or is there another potentially good outcome to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that will benefit America's national interests and the people on the ground. Each one of these distinguished scholars will address the issue, and they all have an outstanding record of discussing this issue and debating it in the elite media of the country. The conflict remains at the heart and peace and stability of the whole region and dramatically affects U.S. national interests, and that's what our concern is here today to discuss. So we will take the speakers in the order that you have them. Jeremy, you'll be first. In the order that you have them, is it? Oh, I'm sorry, the program. Yeah, Jeremy, I have your bio first. Ian Lustick will be, Professor Lustick will be the first to speak. And for those of you that have the program, his bio is on the back of the program, and he's the 4th one down. And if you'll read that, you'll save him time to deliver his speech. Dr. Lustick.
Thanks, Omar, and thank you for coming. Thank you to the Middle East Policy Council for organizing what I hope will be an informative and stimulating exchange. I'm confident it will be. So my name is Ian Lustick. I'm a Jew from a shtetl in northern New York called Watertown. In high school, I was a member of the modern Orthodox youth movement, the National Conference of Synagogue Youth. I was actually a chapter president. We used to sing and dance to scores of nigunim, that is, Hasidic-type melodies, for hours on end. The song I loved the best was one that we couldn't dance to. You didn't dance to it. It's called Ani Ma'amin, I believe. Almost all Jewish Israelis and most Jews know the words, the powerful melody, and the deep emotion of its message. It translates like this: I believe with a complete faith in the coming of the Messiah. And although he may tarry, yet I will wait for him. I will wait for him all the days of my life. The deep meaning of the song is that whether or not the Messiah comes, and whether or not there really is a Messiah waiting to come, the yearning for what his arrival would mean and the injunction never to lose hope for mankind are values in and of themselves that help make life worth living. Much of the intelligent and passionate criticism I've received in response to my New York Times op-ed piece, Two-State Illusion, is the critic's own version of Ani Ma'amin. It is an anxious yet defiant song of resistance against despair by professing against all odds complete faith in the coming of the two-state solution. The reality is that God will not announce that the Messiah is not coming, nor, regarding a negotiated two-state solution, will he announce when the point of no return, making that impossible, has actually been passed. But there is a great difference between the two. There's really not much to lose by declaring Moshiach ben David, the Messiah, son of David, will come even if he will not. But there is a tremendous amount to lose by continuing to advocate two-state plans that cannot be implemented when the evil designs of others can exploit that error. The most important message in my article was not that two states are absolutely impossible. Indeed, I did not say that and do not believe it. Rather, my argument is that paths to political decisions in Israel and the United States that could result in that outcome via negotiations are so implausible that the negotiations themselves end up protecting and deepening oppressive conditions. In addition, by diverting energies from the difficult search for alternatives, however painful they may be, fixation on the tantalizing mirage of the two-state solution's imminent arrival increases the likelihood that when transformative change comes, and it will come, that change will be catastrophic. Let me be clear. I am not claiming, and I did not claim, that I have discovered a realistic path forward to satisfying the legitimate rights of Jews and Arabs in Palestine, the land of Israel. Such a path may exist, but it may not. For several decades, I believed, and I think correctly, that internationally brokered direct negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians had a good chance of achieving a real two-state solution that would both naturalize Israel's presence in the region and provide Jews and Palestinians with limited but democratic and satisfactory outlets for their collective aspirations. Problems there would have been, but those problems would have been much preferable to those associated with any other course of action. To be sure, neither its benefits nor its implementation were ever sure things. To have pulled off the two-state solution while it was available would have been in some ways more amazing than the establishment of the State of Israel itself. It would have made Israel the only European fragment society to have successfully institutionalized its presence in a non-European region without effectively eliminating the Aboriginal population. The odds were always against the two-state solution's success, whether because of the crippling hold that a blinkered Israel lobby has on American foreign policy in the region, the Islamicization of politics in the Arab world, or a cultural transformation of the Israeli political landscape driven by decades of siege, Holocaust mania, and triumphalism. The argument I'm making is not that I have a better plan for a nice future than two-state true believers possess. It is that if catastrophic scales of destruction can be avoided, ways to do so will not be found by those blinded by faith in an appealingly familiar but no longer effectively available path. Why? Because as long as Israelis and Palestinians do not feel immediately and concretely that their very existence is threatened by the absence of a way to live together, they will not question the assumptions that need to be questioned. What are those assumptions that need to be questioned? For Israelis, is statist Zionism the only framework for satisfying Jewish national and cultural ambitions? Can the fundamental inconsistency between Jewish stateness and principles of citizen equality be the actual basis for stable relations between equal and powerfully mobilized Jewish and non-Jewish communities? Can those who live in a villa survive in a jungle unless the jungle is transformed into villas or the villa becomes a part of the jungle? Can the Jews of Israel ever expect to win an endless competition in brutality with the other peoples of the Middle East? For Palestinians, can Palestinians as a people survive an all-out struggle between a Muslim Middle East and a Jewish state capable of using weapons of mass destruction? Can a Palestinian Zionist movement intent on achieving the return to its land generations after the loss of that land be more successful, humane, or stabilizing in its effects than the Jewish version? Can the category of Palestinian embrace Jews in a way that the category of Zionist was unable to embrace Palestinians? In my essay, I suggest a variety of things that could happen in a radically changed Middle East. I do not offer those ideas as forecasts, but as examples of possibilities that may help two-staters understand the category of theoretically possible but highly implausible. A category which not now also includes the negotiated route to a two-state solution. I agree that despite the fact that ultra-Orthodox Jews and Muslims do ally with one another in the Israeli parliament to support segregated schools and strict dietary rules in public facilities, it is a stretch to think of those two groups allying themselves more broadly. Certainly, it is difficult to imagine the circumstances that would lead most Mizrahi Jews in Israel to identify also as Arab. On the other hand, if Germans and Jews could be close allies within 2 generations following the Holocaust, and if my own side of the Jewish world has no problem referring to itself as Ashkenazi, i.e. German, then why think a changing mix of challenges and opportunities cannot lead Jews from Arab countries to acknowledge their heritage in parallel fashion? Politics, as I noted, makes strange bedfellows, but only when circumstances demand it. That's what rough politics does. Rough politics is not something that moves according to a plan, but rough politics is how history produces most of the outcomes to protracted struggles. Those outcomes are seldom the solutions that anyone planned for or sought systematically to bring about. Right now, for example, there is no one-state solution, but there is a one-state outcome. Between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, there is one and only one real state, Israel. It has shown repeatedly that it can and will send its military forces into any corner of that territory whenever it deems necessary. The Palestinian Authority's nominal administration over some domains and Hamas's position in Gaza notwithstanding, virtually nothing goes into or out of this entire area that the State of Israel does not authorize. The question then is not whether there can be one state in the country. The answer to that question is obvious. There is. The question is, what is that state like, and can it be changed? Are there outcomes available that are more compatible with principles of democratic and human rights for all the country's inhabitants and those with rights to live there? Here's where I agree with the argument that, absent successful negotiations, and no one has produced a scintilla of evidence that these negotiations currently underway will succeed where so many others have failed, absent successful negotiations, Lebanonization or apartheid are the 2 most likely medium-term outcomes. On the other hand, as we can see from the South African case, and to an extent in Lebanon, neither anarchy nor oppression are durable over the long run. What I have tried to do is draw attention to how the dead plan walking, known as the two-state solution, facilitates the integration of masses of disenfranchised Palestinians into the control system of the Israeli state, blunting pressures that otherwise would be brought to bear on the protagonists and discouraging new forms of mobilization and cultural change. In this way, with its prospects reduced from the plausible to the theoretically possible, a negotiated two-state solution and the discourse surrounding it remain key factors in the political equation. Indeed, the fundamental reason for Prime Minister Netanyahu's embrace of the slogan, drained of all real meaning, of course, is that the tantalizing image of its availability sucks all oxygen out of the political atmosphere. To be sure, the large-scale pressures, mobilizations, and psychological shifts necessary to make progress possible cannot be predicted in detail. But only thus can a situation featuring a single state that dominates life between the Jordan and Sea be transformed into a society within which more satisfactory, confederal, unitary, regional, binational, or even eventually two-state arrangements could evolve. An interesting dimension of many published critiques by two-staters of my New York Times essay is the extent to which they agree with the core of my analysis. even if often accompanied by shrill attacks on my motives, knowledge, or bona fides. I believe most would probably agree with me that the systematic efforts of Israeli annexationists and their supporters outside of Israel to destroy paths to the two-state solution constitute one of the greatest crimes ever committed in Jewish history. Like me, they find themselves unable to trace a series of steps that could lead from where we are now to a satisfying two-state solution. Like me, they decry the fetishization of negotiations and Washington's chronic failure to act decisively. Like me, they understand the negotiations as serving many petty parochial interests rather than the objective of achieving peace. Down deep, I think they also agree that neither the Kerry version nor any version of negotiations per se will be capable of bringing about a two-state solution. Some larger set of political forces will need to appear that will shake up the political landscape, especially in Israel, with sufficient force to produce a government ready to sign the agreement whose detailed provisions, they say, everyone already knows. The exact place where I differ with many of these critics is in the scale of the political shifts that need to occur in order to enable real progress. For example, Avner Inbar and Asaf Sharon have pointed to what they describe as the potentially game-changing option of Palestinians bringing their case to the UN. They imply that this is the kind of development that could jolt the two-state project back to life. I disagree. I do not argue, as they and others say I do, that the weight of sheer settlement as facts on the ground is what is decisive. Not at all. There were nearly twice the number of settlers in Algeria as there are east of the Green Line, and they were all evacuated. However, that evacuation was not produced by an FLN maneuver at the UN. It was the complex consequence of the overthrow of the Fourth Republic in France, years of emergency rule in the Hexagon, a horribly bloody revolution in Algeria, and the reconstitution of political life in France under a radically new constitution. My point is that it is not the settlements per se that are the problem, but the political constellation of power and purpose that produced them, that grows them, and that will protect them. What I am arguing is that the entrenchment of the forces in Israel that have destroyed every effort to achieve two states is so deep and so firmly rooted in ideological, cultural, and American institutional political realities that much bigger forces will be necessary to transform them than operate within the normal course of Israeli or United Nations politics. My message is not a happy one. The whole situation is deeply tragic. While there were unavoidable contradictions buried in all Zionist plans for transforming Palestine, the post-1967 period did open up the spectacularly hopeful prospect of successful partition. It is with profound sadness that I find that prospect has effectively vanished as a political program. But my commitment to Jewish values, democratic principles of government, and the human beings I know and love on each side of the conflict's terrible divide demand I face that sadness with the tools I have. I'm not a prophet, nor am I a political leader. I am a political scientist. What I owe is no more and no less than the best analysis I can provide of a political situation that is turning the hard work of peace movement heroes into threats to what they themselves hold most dear. I argued for the two-state solution beginning in 1969, and ironically, for years was called a self-hating Jew because I supported two states. The passion I put into that effort was spurred by my certainty of the doom that intensive settlement of the territories would mean for the Zionist dream I embraced of a democratic, Jewish, and civilized state. As I have said, God will not announce when pursuing that dream becomes or became an empty hope, but any advocate of that political project must judge how he or she will know when that time arrives. Otherwise, the illusion of its assumedly permanent availability will strengthen those ready to base Jewish life in the land of Israel on systematic coercion and permanent oppression.
Thank you. My name is Yousef Munayyer. I'd like to thank Tom and Ahmad and the Middle East Policy Council for the opportunity to address you today and for convening this important panel. We find ourselves today, 20 years since the Oslo Accords, in a position where many still advocate for two states. And two states, in fact, is the stated policy objective of this country's government, while in reality, we have never been further from two states on the ground. It's time to wake up. What we have today is a one-state reality. The one-state versus two-state debate is not so much a debate about which solution is better at all. To have a debate about which solution is more appropriate, there must first be an agreement about what the problem is we are seeking to solve. Increasingly, the two-state, one-state divide is characterized by an overlapping divide in an understanding of the problem. Two-state proponents see the problem as demographic, leading to the conclusion that drawing a line can solve it. One-state proponents tend to see the problem as one of rights denied, which can only be corrected by fully affording those rights. In my view, the problem has never been about finding space for two nationalisms in one geography, but rather about the basic rights denied to the native inhabitants of that geography for the purpose of empowering just one particular demography. The foundations of Zionism, wrote the prolific and brilliant critic Hannah Arendt, in the 1940s, were laid during a time when nobody could imagine any solution of minority or nationality problems other than the autonomous national state with a homogeneous population. Zionists, she said, are afraid the whole building might crack if they abandon their old ideas. The contrary is true, she says. The building will collapse if we don't adapt our minds and our ideas to new facts and new developments. The interesting question to me is not one state or two. It's clear that the answer is the former. Rather, the interesting question to me, and one that we should all be asking, is why? Why, despite stated policy naming two states as the objective, and despite growing policy advocacy in favor of that objective, are we further from that objective in reality today than ever? The answer, I believe, is even though the truth is blindingly obvious, it's inconvenient for many, especially politically. This forces two-state proponents to formulate advocacy based less on the landscape on the ground and more on the landscape of argumentation. More often than not, this means behaving reactively and operating in the little space left available for dissent in an overwhelmingly Zionist discourse in Washington and more broadly in the United States. This approach is problematic, to say the least, and leads to the promulgation of several myths. These myths end up creating expectations that are never fulfilled. One state or two, we must correct this method of advocacy or continue to watch it falter. Allow me to enumerate the three most problematic myths. Myth number one, Middle East peace and the creation of a Palestinian state is a, quote, vital national security interest of the United States. I can't tell you how many times I've heard this, especially from those dedicated to two-state advocacy. This became something of a battle cry after 9/11. The logic being that the blowback from prolonged U.S. support for Israel at the expense of Palestinians will cost the United States. This much is true. Palestine is the bleeding heart of the Arab world and the cause of discontent among many across state borders. But a vital national security interest? That's beyond a stretch. Let's define this for a moment. A vital national security interest is, in plain terms, an interest the United States would use military force to defend. Seeing that the United States will not so much as condition aid to Israel in an effort to change its colonial behavior in the West Bank, I think it's safe to say that there is nothing vital about this interest. The United States' vital interests in the region are straightforward. It cares about maintaining Israel as an ally in the region and propping up other allied regimes. The overarching goal in the region has always been the same: ensuring stability to facilitate the free flow of natural resources out of the region. Now, Palestine can be connected to this. There's no doubt that the prolonged statelessness of Palestinians has had destabilizing effects on the region that nearly even brought the United States to war. In Jordan in the fall of 1970, the United States was only a few Syrian tanks away from what could have been military confrontation with the Soviet Union. But much has changed since then. The instability of Palestinian statelessness has largely been contained to the occupied territories, thanks to an abomination known as the Oslo Accords, which imploded a problematic PLO into an even more problematic Palestinian Authority, and, of course, thanks to steadfast Israeli repression. So the question of Palestine is far from being a vital national security interest for the United States. That being said, a peace agreement could serve U.S. interests in the region, insofar as it contributes to regional stability. But this is a secondary, if not tertiary, objective. This means that while it might serve U.S. interests, crafting policy to achieve it involves a calculus that gives great deference to other interests, including domestic political constraints, which are strongly opposed to this end. This brings us then to myth number 2. Myth number 2, ending the occupation is in Israel's interest. This, too, is a popular mantra of two-state advocacy, the idea being that Israel, an ostensible Jewish and democratic state, cannot subjugate millions of voiceless Palestinians without an identity crisis. But this dangerously conflates the interests of the state with the interests of maintaining this identity. Israel's claim to Jewish democracy and Israel's interests are two very different things. This much is evidenced by the fact that a growing number of Israelis are perfectly willing to jettison the notion of democracy in favor of demographic supremacy and keeping the majority of the settlements. So what interests are involved in the occupation, and perhaps more importantly, what interests weigh into the decision to end the occupation? Israel today is a strong state with a thriving economy. True, it is increasingly isolated in the world, but few Israelis seem to genuinely care. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis, about 10% of the population, live in occupied territory. These folks vote, and they vote in growing numbers. In a study I did on Israeli election data from 2009 and 2013, the most recent election, the most striking thing I found was when you disaggregate settlement voters and non-settlement voters, what you find is over a 4-year period, there was a 6.2% increase in the number of eligible voters outside the settlements, whereas inside the settlements, that increase was a remarkable 45% over 4 years. This is due in part to state policies of settlement expansion and financial incentives encouraging the transfer of civilians to the settlements, but also due to the stark disparity in birth rates between the settlements and those not in the settlements. Couple this with the fact that while turnout in the main population centers outside the settlements, like Tel Aviv, for example, was about 62%, turnout in the settlements was 78%. Then throw into the mix the fact that most Israelis that did not vote for Likud or the religious nationalist parties are more concerned about the price of cottage cheese than some abstract notion of identity, and you can clearly see why Israeli settlers and their interests are overrepresented in the decision-making officialdom in Israel and will continue to be into the future. But these are just the political costs. There are other costs associated with Israel making the decision to end the occupation. Some naively argue that since Israeli settlements exist by virtue of the Israeli military's defense of them, if the Israeli military withdrew, the settlers would quickly leave. But as we saw in Gaza, there's nothing simple or cheap about this exercise. Aside from the need to use military force to evacuate the settlements in Gaza, the resettlement costs of about 5,000 Israeli settlers, many of whom, by the way, resettled in the occupied West Bank, cost about $1 billion US. Think then about 20 times this number. That number, about 100,000, is a conservative estimate of the number of settlers that would have to be removed in a very unfavorable land swap deal for the Palestinians. This is not Yamit we're talking about here. But let us, for the sake of argument, think about that number. Based on resettlement costs from the 2005 withdrawal, which is, by the way, in 2005 dollars, this would cost about 10% of Israel's current GDP. Add to this the additional value Israel gains from the occupation, including the exploitation of the land and resources, prime among which, of course, is precious water. Israel illegally takes some 80% of the mountain aquifers water, which is located in the West Bank. That water is a significant portion of the state's supply, 60% of which is devoted to domestic agriculture. In the last few days, the World Bank released an important and detailed report on the impact of Area C closures on the Palestinian economy. What was clear was that in Area C, Palestinians are losing out on billions of dollars in potential economic rewards from the land, the water, the mineral resources, tourism, and so on. What is not explicitly stated, but is nonetheless clear, is who is reaping these economic rewards in the meantime: the State of Israel. Some will concede that Israel reaps many rewards from the occupation, but note that there are also costs to a prolonged military presence in the West Bank. Surely there are, but those costs have only become more and more bearable under the two-state framework and its peace process. In fact, Israeli defense consumption in relation to its GDP is, in recent years, at record lows. Over the course of the past 20 years, that number has halved. So while there are military costs associated with the occupation, they have only declined and continue to decline during peace processing, while the rewards of occupation and the costs of withdrawal have only increased in large part thanks to the same process. If we're going to talk about Israel's interests vis-a-vis the occupation, let's talk about real, cold, hard interests, not abstract interests. It's only the former that actually influences state behavior. This brings us then to myth number 3. Myth number 3, the status quo is unsustainable. It's said that a lie told often enough becomes truth. I don't know if that's the case, but I do know that a lie told often enough might be repeated by the president and other principals of his administration. Indeed, in 2011, President Obama said about Israel, quote, "Precisely because of our friendship, it is important that we tell the truth. The status quo is unsustainable. The dream of a Jewish and democratic state cannot be fulfilled with permanent occupation." The same was uttered by his then Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. If anything has been sustainable in the turbulent Middle East for the last half-century, longer than Mubarak and longer than Gaddafi, it has been Israel's occupation. Sure, nothing is sustainable forever. At one point, I suppose the Grand Canyon was just a river. But it's particularly disingenuous to hear this language from the very officials who are crafting policy to ensure that the status quo remains sustainable. As I've already discussed, not only is the Israeli occupation sustainable, it is profitable. Indeed, Israel has done almost all it can to ensure the occupation persists for generations by carving up the West Bank with colonies and entrenching its presence there. Washington has done little to stop it and is, in fact, actively encouraging it with economic and diplomatic support. There was a time only 20 years ago when a U.S. Secretary of State was rallying international support to get behind a UN Security Council resolution condemning Israeli settlements as illegal. Not illegitimate, but illegal. Today, it is the United States that is single-handedly standing in the way of such a resolution by using its veto despite vast international support for it. The status quo is absolutely sustainable in large part because of Washington's unyielding support for Israel. Telling ourselves otherwise, despite this obvious reality, is a recipe for disappointment and disillusionment. Why is it so important to debunk these myths? By allowing these myths to be our assumptions, we permit unrealistic expectations to come about. If, for example, a peace deal was a vital national security interest of the United States, and if ending the occupation was in Israel's interest, and if there was an urgency created by an unsustainable status quo, well, then you'd expect all that is necessary is to bring the parties together to the negotiating table for a ripe deal to be made. If power acts in its interest, and with these assumptions we'd think that would be the case, the negotiations should lead to the desired outcome. Instead, as we have seen, negotiations have only led to the opposite outcome. In fact, it is due to the illusions these myths create that many can't see the blatant double standard so perfectly captured by President Obama himself in recent weeks. It was just last week that President Obama told NPR, in regard to the stance House Republicans were taking by refusing to pass a continuing resolution before a government shutdown deadline, quote, "You don't negotiate by putting a gun to the other person's head." And yet, only days earlier, President Obama said, after meeting with Mahmoud Abbas on the sidelines of the UNGA, that negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians it occupies, not merely with a gun to their head, but with an entire foreign military occupation in their land, negotiations were, quote, the best way, the only way for a successful outcome. These myths and assumptions also lead to an unrealistic and unhelpful understanding of responsibility and blame. If it's good for the United States and good for Israel, why hasn't it happened, we are led to believe? It must be because of Palestinian rejectionism. Moving forward, we need to revisit these assumptions, challenge these myths, and radically alter policy if there's going to be a change in the situation. Here's what most liberal Zionist two-state advocates and what most other two-state advocates constrained by US domestic politics don't want to tell you or are afraid to tell you. Without massive, and I underscore massive, pressure on Israel, Israel has no reason to change the status quo. Advocacy for a two-state outcome without advocacy for massive pressure on Israel to bring it at minimum into full compliance with international law is, in effect, advocacy for perpetual occupation and is in part responsible for the morass of today. All of this brings us back to the more fundamental question. Should policy advocacy aim for what is right, fair, and just, or should it aim for the path of least resistance given the powers that be? I don't know where the United States might be if Martin Luther King chose the latter. I don't know where South Africa might be if Mandela chose the latter. I do know, however, where Israel-Palestine would be if advocates continue to choose the latter, precisely where we are today, but with more settlers and an even deeper-rooted version of Israeli apartheid. It's time, as Hannah Arendt said, to adapt our minds and our ideas to the present reality and imagine new paths forward. Thank you.
Introduce yourself. Okay. Before you start, Jeremy, if you've got questions, be writing them and sending them forward, or there are people along the side to pick them up.
So, good morning, everybody. I'm Jeremy Ben-Ami. I'm the president and founder of J Street, and perhaps the foil for today's discussion. I want to thank Omar and Tom for this opportunity to engage in what I consider to be an extraordinarily important and respectful discussion of whether or not there really is an alternative to a two-state solution for resolving the long-standing conflict between the Jewish and the Palestinian people over the land that we call Israel and Palestine. It goes without saying that I find myself in the slightly unusual position today of serving as the right end of the political spectrum. As some of you may know, I spend much of my time engaged in a different political dynamic, so I'm very grateful to the Middle East Policy Council for a little change of venue for me. Let me open up my remarks by just saying forthrightly and clearly that I am a proud and unapologetic supporter of the State of Israel and of the right of the Jewish people to a state of their own in the land of Israel. My family was among the very first Jews to return to the area in the 1880s. They fled persecution in Russia, and they sought to rebuild the home of the Jewish people in the land of Israel that their ancestors had dreamed of and longed for centuries. The movement that they were a part of, Zionism, fit neatly into a larger trend in the 19th century towards nationalism that blossomed as peoples across the globe sought to establish their right to self-determination and to claim a place among the community of nations. So today, most of my family lives in Israel, as I myself did for several years, and I remain firmly committed to both the necessity of a Jewish homeland and the justice of its existence, its defense, and its survival. My belief in Jewish nationalism is rooted in history. Both the millennia-long connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel and the need for one place, somewhere on the globe, where Jewish people can live safely and securely in a home of their own, given our people's tragic history when living in the lands of others. Let me state equally proudly and unapologetically that there will only be security, peace, and justice for the Jewish people and their national home when there is security, peace, and justice for the Palestinian people. I and J Street, the organization that I represent, do believe that the Palestinian people have the same right to freedom and to self-determination as the Jewish people. I and J Street do oppose the ever-expanding settlement enterprise on the West Bank and the ongoing occupation that exists in post-1967 occupied territories. The present situation does threaten the national interest of the state of Israel, a state that is only the home of the Jewish people if it is both democratic and Jewish in nature. And the present situation threatens Israel's long-term survival physically, but it threatens the moral fiber of the Jewish people as well. So those starting points lead directly to the question we're here today to discuss, which is, how do we resolve a conflict between two people who both have valid rights and claims? For all the complexity at the heart of this conflict and for all the deep emotions that it understandably taps over not just the past 45 years, not just the past 60 plus years, not just the past 100 years, but over millennia, I do maintain that this conflict must be understood as a conflict between two people who have a legitimate and conflicting claim to one piece of land. And I only see three options for resolving that conflict. One, continue to fight until somebody wins and takes control of the land in its entirety. Two, divide that land in some way and agree to be satisfied with only a piece of what you want. Or three, to share it without dividing it. I firmly believe that there is only one viable option, and that is the second, division of the land into two independent states. I hope that all of us in this room, everybody on the panel, would join together in rejecting option one and agree there is no zero-sum solution in which one winner takes all. Well, there are those on both sides of this conflict who may harbor that illusion. Theirs is a path that is paved in blood, pain, and suffering that I hope all of goodwill seeking peace reject. But I know that many in this room and on this panel would argue for the third option, for sharing the land. I understand the frustration over the failures of the last 20 years since the beginning of the Oslo era. And I understand that faced with that frustration, they suggest stopping trying. Don't try to divide what can't be divided. Start figuring out how to live together as one big, happy family in one big, binational state. Let me just note that on my right, politically as well, there's growing interest in exactly that, in a one-state outcome, but for different reasons. In the version of one state supported by the settler leaders whom we all oppose, and by Israel's most right-wing politicians, all those from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea would become part of one big state, but they wouldn't share equal rights. I'll assume for the sake of discussion here, and I've heard that this morning, that those on the panel with me are only considering one-state options that incorporate having equal rights, regardless of race, religion, and background. And I do understand, Professor Lustick, why this one-state model has some attraction, especially for American liberals who've become used to lauding the development in our own nation of an increasingly multi-ethnic and multicultural society. If we all manage to get along here in America, surely Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs can get along just fine in some imaginary single state. Let's call it Israeltine. I don't view this as a solution. I don't call this a one-state solution. I regard it instead as the perpetuation of a one-state nightmare. And a quick review of the political trends in recent history around the world shows we're moving away from and not toward some form of humanist utopia. Look at the former Yugoslavia, which split into 7 separate nations amid a frenzy of bloodshed and ethnic cleansing. Look at Belgium, where French and Flemish-speaking Belgians are barely on speaking terms. Or at Spain, where Catalans are joining hands in a human chain 250 miles long to demand independence. Czechs and Slovaks recently agreed to go their own separate ways. Even the Scots want out of the United Kingdom. And then there's the Middle East, where the fabric of multinational coexistence, which was enforced for centuries by the Ottomans and more recently by military strongmen, is violently unraveling before our eyes. Lebanon is torn between Shiites and Sunnis, Christians and Druze, barely hanging together. Iraq remains tormented by bloody terrorist attacks. Egypt's Coptic minority is the frequent target of attacks, and of course Syria has disintegrated into an all-out civil war. Forcing a roughly equal number of Jews and Palestinians to coexist in one state and to compete for political power, economic resources, and overall control is not a solution. It's a formula for similar tension, conflict, and bloodshed. A two-state solution for Israelis and Palestinians offers both peoples a way to avoid such a fate. It is the only way to give them both what they want: national self-determination. And I, again, understand the deep frustration over a generation now of trying to reach a diplomatic solution. And believe me, I also understand the lack of belief that the present Israeli government intends in good faith to end this conflict. But I don't buy the notion that the obstacles in the path of getting to the goal of a two-state solution mean that the destination itself is wrong. To my mind, the right answer is to redouble our efforts to remove those obstacles so we can reach our goal. And I'm pleased to say that with the energy and determination that is being brought today to the cause by Secretary Kerry, there is reason for renewed optimism. If these efforts fail and the two peoples end up forced to live together in one state, I see little chance of that turning into a blissful paradise of equality and coexistence. Instead, I think we would be condemning our children and grandchildren to a never-ending cycle of violence and bloodshed as both people seek control and dominion over the other. I look forward in the coming discussion to understanding better how those who promote a one-state future propose to deal with the practical issues, such as establishing the political rules of engagement in such a state. Who gets to vote? Who has the right to citizenship? How are resources allocated? How are the national defenses of this hypothetical state established and run? And how do all these rules get set in the first place? Wouldn't the negotiations over establishing such a system be at least as complex and even less likely to succeed than the negotiations over a two-state solution? All of our children and their children and the generations that follow will be far better served if the Jewish people and the Palestinian people each have a country that they can call home. Each of these two nations should provide full and equal rights to all citizens regardless of race, ethnicity, or religion. Religious freedom and the rights of all people in both states should be fully respected, and full access should be provided to the religious sites of all faiths. Two successful states for two peoples living side by side could potentially bring those peoples far closer together than they are today, affirming similar economic, security, and cultural interests rather than their differences. But for now, my focus is not on idealism, but on a practical solution to a generations-old conflict, a conflict that has taken too many lives, caused too much suffering, and needs to be brought to an end. And the only sustainable, long-term resolution to this conflict is one that meets the most basic requirements of both parties: security and independence from one another and self-determination. I understand that the bottom line for the Palestinian people in any resolution is that their rights must be recognized and respected, and wounds must be healed. In particular, that means a just and agreed resolution to the refugee issue. But I ask in return that the bottom line for the Jewish people be recognized and respected as well. And that is that the security and survival of a national home for the Jewish people in the land of Israel be recognized and guaranteed. And that will only happen through a two-state solution. Anything else is not a formula for resolving the conflict, but for perpetuating it. Thank you.
Ahmad. Ahmad, introduce yourself.
My name is Ahmad Khalidi. I am Palestinian from Jerusalem. My family is from Jerusalem. We trace our origins back to about 1,000 years. The Nusaybi's claim to have been there before us, but they have no proof of that. And I have grown up in the diaspora. I'm currently based in England. I've been active in Palestinian politics for about 500 years. Mostly in official and unofficial peacemaking, and with great success, as you can see from today's panel. I wish to thank Tom and Omar and the Middle East Policy Council for bringing me over at no little expense. I hope they find it worthwhile. How can we characterize the Middle East today? Fundamentally, there's a rampant regional civil war across the Levant, from Lebanon's shores to the Iraqi-Iranian borders. Now it has taken on a substantially sectarian character, Sunni Shiite, with multiple underlays. Here and elsewhere in the region, there are ethnic, economic factors, regional power struggles, historical rivalries, personal animosities, grand power politics, generational transitions, youthful frustrations. All of these have created a maze of interconnected, overlapping conflicts and fault lines. Out of this turmoil, we have had new borders and new identities. In southern Sudan, there's a new state. In Syria, there's any number of statelets. Iraq has broken apart. Libya is polarized. Yemen is likely to go the same way. And the map, as has been now widely recognized, is changing shape, and its geopolitical permutations remain unpredictable. Will there be a new Kurdish state, for instance? Will new tribal and confessional entities redraw the region along more or less stable lines? Will the collapse into more primordial and less heterogeneous policies, or polities rather, ultimately bring peace and coexistence? Or will the forcibly cleansed ethnic, tribal, or confessional entities that are emerging remain in perpetual conflict and competition? Will they be at least as much a source of chronic instability as their predecessors? We've already seen the tide of shifting, competing axes and alignments come and go. Alliances and forces appear and wither. Yesterday's Muslim Brotherhood, which seemed to be sweeping through the region, is now being swept out of power, apparently in relentless retreat. New powers have emerged, dominated, and then receded. Qatar, yesterday's master of the region, today has shrunk back into its football stadiums. Old players appear to be on the verge of extinction, only to prove a confounding survivability and sustaining power, our good friend President Assad of Syria. Where is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in all of this? Certainly, it's not the most visible. And compared to the rest, it is in a pacific moment, a relatively bloodless one, thank God. But visibility should not be confused with saliency. The Palestine-Israel conflict, amongst other things, is the point of convergence and intersection between almost all the elements that I have mentioned above: borders, ethnicities, identities, religion, nationalism, all come together here on this ground. Its relative insulation from what is around it today is no indication of its incendiary potential, as we have witnessed before on many occasions. And furthermore, it is of global resonance. It is not a local affair, partly as a consequence of its history and the historicity of its place and its players, and partly because Israel is integral to the US political fabric, as is Palestine to the political and moral consciousness of millions around the globe. When the US wants to go to war in and around the region, it is Israel that is invoked, for better or for worse. When protesters mass in Tehran, Ahmad against Western injustice, real or perceived, Palestine is still a genuine rallying call. Will a Palestine-Israel solution address everything and resolve all these conflicts in the region? Of course not. No fool would say so, not even this one. Will it help to create a stable zone in a sea of turmoil? Most probably yes. Will its perpetuation as an open sore help to make the world a better place? Undoubtedly not. This, I think, very simply, is the very basic calculus of the United States today. It is also the calculus of Israel and the PA-PLO's own dynamic. Putting myself in Israel's position for a moment of this Israeli government, you see an ever-expanding path towards growing delegitimization, spreading Jewish communal divisions in the diaspora, and a genuine demographic and political dilemma on the ground. How do you preserve the Jewish state when you're spread between and amongst roughly 4 Palestinians? And for the moment as well, if I'm Bibi Netanyahu, Iran certainly looms large, not just for the day when, but for the day after whatever happens is going to happen. Because if you want the world to support you on the day after you do what you have to do, the key, I think, that Bibi has come to realize lies in a potential movement with the Palestinians. Palestine, if you want, for Netanyahu, has become the key to Tehran. But for Ramallah, the road ahead is also very uncertain. This leadership's slender national credentials hang by a thread. There's no visible alternative to them, but they still represent the very last breeze from the Palestinian national movement's winds of the 60s. The national project, so-called of 1988, which is to build a state for Palestinians on this territories occupied in 1967, is still at the PLO's shaky core. And all talk of UN unilateral action notwithstanding, the PLO leadership today, which is wedded to a negotiated solution, has little option of divorce from it. So what about a two-state solution? A two-state solution is not a new invention. It is a very respectable 76-year-old Peel. Lord Peel in 1937 was the first to propose a two-state solution. It was, of course, tried in 1947 again. It was manifestly unacceptable from the Arab point of view then. This is not the place to debate it. But it only really sprung back to life after the PLO adopted it unilaterally in 1988. Indeed, the much maligned Yasser Arafat is today the father of the latter-day two-state solution. It seems to have been forgotten by all those who are adamantly supporting it today that it was adamantly opposed yesterday by the US and Israel for almost a decade. Even in 1999, just before Camp David, Mr. Barak, the leader of the Labour Party in Israel, refused to include the two-state solution on the Labour Party electoral program. It was not until 2003, paradoxically, that it was adopted by Israel, and not until by Sharon, and not until 2009 that Bibi was converted to it. But nonetheless, it is today the only vehicle that is the common ground between all parties to the conflict: Israel, Palestine, and Arab. Even Hamas does not oppose in principle, and it would take a massive political earthquake to shift this cumbersome ship from its course. The fact is that there's no real plan B. There's no negotiable solution. There are many other options, but if we're talking about negotiations, there is no negotiable solution to alternative to a two-state solution. The practical alternatives are unacceptable to one or both parties. An interim or provisional state or process on the one end, or a one-state solution on the other. And in between, the whole range of unilateral actions that will only involve, at best, a partial and temporary solution. I do not want for the moment to dispute the difficulties of reaching a fair and sustainable two-state solution. There is no doubt about the narrowing window that Secretary of State Kerry spoke of earlier this year at his confirmation hearings in Congress. I personally came to this conclusion many years ago. How does one shift 500,000 settlers out of the West Bank? How does one divide Jerusalem in a way that's workable? How do you get the Israelis out of the Jordan Valley after Bibi Netanyahu's told Abbas that he wants to stay there for 30 years? How do you ensure Palestinian security against future threat? How do you resolve the refugee problem and address the issue of a Jewish state? The problems of negotiating have to do with signing, ratifying, implementing, verifying, and then sustaining. Signing, ratifying, implementing, verifying, and sustaining. And these are immense. The first, that of negotiating, is just the very, very first hurdle. In spite of all of this, I believe that the prospects of actually reaching an agreement today are not negligible. And we should be prepared not because the parties have suddenly turned to peacemongering, if there's such a thing, but because the short to medium term, in the short to medium term, every other alternative looks worse to one or both sides. And this is not about optimism or pessimism. It's about reading which way the compass, which direction the compass is pointing. A catastrophic failure of the talks, however, should lead to a rethink. And again, this is not necessarily new. I've been recently involved in a 5-year-old project now called the Parallel State Project, which is a book's just about to be published by, I think, California University Press, edited by Mark Levine and Matthias Mossberg, which is a very interesting idea. The idea is that you take the whole of mandatory Palestine and you have two states, one superimposed over the other, so that, for instance, all the Jews in the land would vote in one parliament, all the Arabs would vote in another, and you could see how this may or may not work. It is indeed, as a matter of principle, very, very hard to argue against the notion of a one state. Ian Lustick makes a very good case, not necessarily for the one state as a virtue, but the one state as a possible outcome. But I would say that it's very hard to dispute the vision of a civic state with one man, one vote, in which everyone can live wherever they want in the whole of mandatory Palestine. I think we can distinguish between 3 forms of one state, and I think one has already been very clearly made, which is the one-state reality. This is not just a reality of today, it's a reality since 1967. This is the apartheid state, the one that we have today. It is a de facto consequence of occupation, and its prevailing characteristics are Israeli domination and oppression of the Palestinian people. The second is one state as a desirable outcome. The question here is how? This, to my mind, is not something that you can negotiate, at least not in the short term. How will the Jewish majority that is in control of every aspect of their life hand over, transfer power to a Palestinian, either similar number of Palestinians or even a Palestinian majority? In many ways, this is very similar to the predicament that the Palestinians found themselves before 1948. I do not see any mobilizable partners to such a project in the short to medium term. The second is that something may arise not out of a rational strategy, but out of the convergence of some unseens and unknowns. Something may happen. But I believe we cannot base politics on maybes or on unseen aspirations. This is neither good strategy nor very good analysis. And as someone who's not unsympathetic to the vision of a one state, there are other enormous problems. Jeremy, I think, has mentioned some of them. Jewish fears of Arab domination, potential deadly competition over land and resources, the issue of Jewish technical and institutional domination, the emergence of a marginalized Arab underclass in a largely Jewish-run state. We've seen all of this before during the one state of the mandate. And furthermore, the region is not providing a perfect model of harmony and communal existence for one to draw on. I believe that the one-state, two-state dichotomy is to some extent false. The two are not necessarily exclusive. One state could eventually arise as the result of two states, and this, for me, could be a very likely outcome. A consensual new regime in mandatory Palestine, born out of enlightened self-interest and after the conflict has been diffused. And this is where the European model becomes relevant. It only took a very few years from the end of World War II to the beginnings of the EU. For the one-statists, the real challenge is to operationalize within a real time frame and a pragmatic political context. How, in essence, do you get Israel to de-Zionize itself in an era of ethnic and religious retrenchment, and at a point where Israel's Jewish population is becoming more nationalist, more religious, more Jewish than Israeli, if you like. Ovadia Yousef's 500,000 mourners yesterday attest to this. But the one-state, two-state dichotomy is not the only consequence. Other things may move as well. The worst case is a descent into intercommunal violence that is now all too common across the region. If Sunni can slaughter Shiite, Arab and Jew within and across the Green Line are perfectly capable of following suit. A more hopeful scenario is one where the Palestinians retrench and reconnect in peaceful pursuit of their three primary national aims: full civil rights in Israel, end of occupation of the territories occupied in 1967, and a fair, just, and justifiable deal for the 1948 refugees, a struggle in which the precise form of national statehood takes second place to other goals. Thank you.
I don't remember having a more clear, intellectually rigorous, with a stack of integrity that four speakers could present to an audience today. I can't thank you enough for your presentations, how outstanding they were, and how honest and rigorous you were about it. And Jeremy, you were brought because of your intellect, not as a foil. For those of you that have questions, would you just hold up your card and we'll start them. We'll start the questions and the discussion with Dr. Munayyer leading, and then we'll take questions that were handed in, and then we'll take questions from the floor. Tom,
Okay.
do you want to take the podium, or do you want to do it from there? Tap it.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I will start with a couple of questions and then ask the panelists to respond to what the others have said, and then take questions for the floor. I think I'd like to start with a question for Jeremy and Ahmad. Given all of the settlements and the bypass roads and the wall and the separation of Gaza from the West Bank, and the political strength of the pro-settlement forces, what are the steps that would have to be taken to make a two-state agreement possible? And actually, Jeremy and I were talking for a minute before the conference about how much evacuation of settlers would be necessary, how much dismantlement of obstacles would be necessary, and how would you patch together the political forces in Israel and the United States to make all that a possibility? And then for Yousef and Ian, I think my question would be, Ian, you haven't advocated one state necessarily. In fact, you've warned that it might only emerge after a lot of blood, after a lot of violent struggle, and that's the catastrophe you'd like to avoid. So could the two of you again talk about how that could be avoided? What concrete steps could be taken now to prepare for the failure of negotiations over two states, and what kinds of changes, what kinds of constitutional foundations would be necessary, and what kinds of institutional transitions would be necessary, and where are we going to find the political forces, constellation of political actors to put that together? And Yousef, when you respond to this, I'd like you to think about one thing, and that is, you were talking about myths and how it's a myth that it's in the U.S. national interest to resolve this, and it's a myth that it's to Israel's advantage to resolve this. It all depends on how you define interests and objectives and strategies, and maybe when you point to American behavior, you're talking about American objectives and American strategies that actually don't conform to American interests. That because of domestic politics and because of a lack of courage and because of a lack of clear thinking, we've got objectives and strategies that are not in the interest. And so maybe it's not actually a myth. That's suggested. So those are my questions. Maybe we could start with Jeremy and Ahmad. And you can do that from your seats, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll address the two questions you asked me, although I have opinions, of course, on all of them. But the two questions are what steps practically can still be taken to achieve a two-state solution, what, given all the obstacles, is possible, and then two is about the politics both in Israel and here in the United States, and I'll particularly talk about the Jewish community. So first of all, my basic argument about why the notion that somehow a window has closed in a manner that can never be opened again on the two-state solution is that all of the obstacles, all of the barriers, which are enormous, be they roads or army bases or walls or buildings, whatever the case may be, the obstacles are, at the end of the day, man-made. And with sufficient political will, recognizing the balance of interests that you began to discuss, they can be man-unmade. It's not easy. Moving 70 to 100,000 people in the context of a negotiated two-state deal from beyond the ultimate border that will be established back to the state of Israel, within the state of Israel, will not be an easy task, and it will require, I believe, wrenching conflict within Israeli society and the Jewish community more broadly. But somebody said resettlement of even as many as several 100,000 people. I think it will only end up being in the neighborhood of 100,000, but even were it several 100,000 people, it was implied that it's not possible. And all I would say is just remember that in the 1990s, the state of Israel absorbed 1 million Soviet Jews who had to leave and wanted to leave the Soviet Union. And within a decade, those 1 million people were housed, employed, integrated into Israeli society without benefit of understanding the language and the culture and all the rest of it. And so it is not impossible. The window can be propped open. The window can be reopened. There is no such thing in a man-made problem as an inability to solve the problem. There just needs to be the will to do it. So I don't buy the concept that this two-state solution is ever actually dead. It will only keep getting more and more costly and difficult to get there. And as I said in my opening remarks, the road that we will have to travel, as Ian said, is going to be bloody and awful, and people will suffer. So that's my answer on the first question about what practicalities. On politics, Israel first. The elections earlier this year marked a tick back towards the center for the Israeli political pendulum. The right-wing bloc today has fewer members than it did prior to the January elections. The number of members of Knesset who support a two-state solution publicly is greater than half of the Knesset. There are members of the coalition, like Tzipi Livni and her whole party, like Tzachi Hanegbi from Likud, who attended the J Street conference this week, who do support a two-state solution. And the politics actually in Israel are resulting in a more extreme right wing, but a right wing that's smaller, and a growing recognition on the center right that in the national self-interest of those who believe in a democratic Jewish home in Israel, in the national interest, there must be a two-state solution. So I would argue that the politics in Israel are actually not shifting inexorably over to the far right, but are in the process of shifting back towards the center, and that the extremists in the settler party and within the Likud are the ones that are becoming smaller and isolated. In the American Jewish community, one only needs to look at the recent surveys that just came out in the last week. One was by the Pew Research Center that talked about the views of Jewish Americans on these topics. And then a second was just published yesterday by the Jewish Council on Public Affairs, which looked at opinions of rabbis, about 600 rabbis in this country. The positions of the American Jewish community on these issues are deeply in line with the two-state outcome that I am outlining. And the political atmosphere in this town is changing. The political atmosphere in this town is coming to recognize that the more extreme right-of-center voices in the Jewish community that we always thought spoke for the entirety of our community do not speak for the entirety of the community, that there is not only a diversity of views within the Jewish community, but actually a majority within the Jewish community who hold moderate, rational, sane views that understand that only through compromise and a two-state solution will there be peace and security for Israel in the long run. And that is changing rapidly. My organization is a symptom of that, perhaps in some ways a bit of a catalyst, but at least a part of a larger wave that is emerging in the American Jewish community. So I would argue the politics here and in Israel are not as bleak as they are sometimes portrayed, and I would argue that the obstacles that do exist are, in fact, removable at great cost, but with the right political will can be done.
I need to premise something and perhaps contradict myself. One of the most extraordinary things that's happened in recent times is that two-state solution has become a Zionist solution in the eyes of almost everybody I talk to, at least on the Palestinian side. Is this on?
Yes.
What was the fulfillment of the national aspirations of the Palestinians, supposedly, has become essentially a means of satisfying Israel's needs for demographic and strategic security. But I think there's a genuine Palestinian national interest still in this. There are very few people who perhaps on the Palestinian side will agree with me, because the vast majority, certainly of young people these days, have gone almost completely into one-statism. And I understand why. Partly it's because of the frustration with the peace process, partly because of the creation of realities on the ground. If we actually have an agreement, that's a very big if, it'll be the very first time that the Palestinians and Israelis have ever agreed on an end game. And that in itself will create a new political reality. It's not enough. But if you can get an agreement, then you change the discourse, the hopes, and the aspiration. It's no longer about something that may or may not happen. It's about something that becomes concrete and achievable. And if this agreement, as it must, if it's going to be at all an agreement, sets the borders, then the issue of settlements, where you continue building and where you don't, will become that less significant, because you'll have decided where the borders are. The same applies to Jerusalem. And the same even applies to the issue of refugees. So even before you enter the phases of implementation, and despite all the difficulties, the very fact that you can achieve a common agreement that sets out where everything is going will completely alter the dynamics of the conflict and the nature of the discourse. And for the short term, I think this is the best we can hope for.
Yes, Ian, do you want to take that second question or comment on that?
Actually, I want to take the first question. I think the second question, maybe Yousef is more focused on it. I'm really focused on this first question. Now, I want to take direct issue with some of the things that Jeremy said in the sense of what's omitted when you accept that line of analysis. There's a huge difference between something being possible and something being plausible enough that it's worth entertaining. If you make the argument that everything that's man-made can be unmade, Israel is man-made. It therefore can be unmade. Therefore, why go for a two-state solution if you can actually go to the root? That is, if you're looking at it from a Palestinian point of view. The answer would be, well, that's absurd. I mean, maybe in principle Israel could be unmade, but it's not a practical possibility, so let's not think about it. In other words, even you, Jeremy, have to operate in the political world distinguishing between things that are theoretically possible and the things that are plausible enough that it's worth pursuing. That is exactly what Secretary of State Kerry said at his confirmation hearing when he said, we've only got, he said in April, a year, 1.5 years, maybe 2 at most. Now, since it's 6 months later, he'd have to say 6 months, a year, 1.5 years at most. Martin Indyk, when he spoke to the J Street conference, said the reason why, and this is a non sequitur, but it's a revealing non sequitur, the reason why this go-around of negotiations will succeed is because it's the last opportunity for it to succeed. The window will be closed, period. Now, yes, that's an exhortation to action, and I can accept, as I do accept, the impossibility of saying that it is impossible. But what's not impossible is saying that the opportunity costs of pursuing something that has a very low plausibility may be too high. That's where I see, Jeremy, that you're not opening that question. What are the opportunity costs of pursuing something that becomes less and less plausible, so much so that the right can pretend to adopt the two-state solution? I mean, when you tell me Tzahya Negbi endorses the two-state solution, I knew Tzahya Negbi a long time ago. I know what makes this guy tick. When you say Bibi Netanyahu speaking at Bar Ilan a couple days ago about the two-state solution and what it entails, they're using you. They're using this mirage, this tantalizing mirage, in order to camouflage and protect the tightening grip of an Israeli version of a one-state solution, which is based on oppression and based on the bet that Jews will be able to outcompete other Middle Easterners in a game of brutality forever. That's their bet. And now, I believe that there was a whole period of time during Oslo, I do not consider it an abomination, when that was a reasonably plausible way to get satisfactory arrangements, and it was not playing into the hand of the right. Now, there's a sense in which the relationship that you have to the right in Israel that is the same relationship as Ben-Gurion had to Abraham Isaac Cook. Abraham Isaac Cook was the intellectual godfather of Gush Emunim, came up with the idea of mystical Zionism, Messianic Zionism. When he looked at Ben-Gurion and the other apikorsim, the sinners, the Jews who wear short pants, had premarital sex, and didn't eat kosher food, he said, it's okay, they're doing God's work. We will inherit their objectives, and we will bring the Messiah and rule over the entire land of Israel. Of course, Ben-Gurion thought that actually it was him who was playing the rabbi. We can see who won in the end. But right now, Jeremy, you have to be aware of the possibility that you're being played in this way. And the way you have to become aware of that is to be able to say out loud, there are certain circumstances in which I will judge that the opportunity costs of continuing down this line are too great. And when I hear you say, under no circumstances will I ever give up, that really does open up the opportunity of permanent exploitation by the other side. I'm going to close with this remark with a joke that I think really does capture why these negotiations are going on. It's actually the last scene of Annie Hall. So here, at the last scene of Annie Hall, Woody Allen gets in front of the camera and he tells a joke. And this is what he says. This guy goes to a psychiatrist and says, Doc, my brother's crazy. He thinks he's a chicken. And the doctor says, well, why don't you turn him in? And the guy says, I would, but I need the eggs. Well, I guess that's pretty much how I feel about relationships, says Woody. You know, they're totally irrational, crazy, and absurd, but I guess we keep going through it because most of us need the eggs. Now, every protagonist in this relationship, and that is in these negotiations, the United States government, the peace industry, the PA, and the current right-wing Israeli governments are getting eggs out of this negotiations. It's got nothing to do with actually getting a solution. And again, I have yet to hear anybody answer what I call the Thetford problem. The Thetford problem, I used to live in New Hampshire, and it's a very crazy kind of system of roads and mountains and rivers, very old. So somebody's lost driving around trying to find Thetford, which is in Vermont. So he asks a local, how do you get to Thetford? The guy stops him and says, well, you can't get there from here. It's not that we can't imagine a there, it's just that you don't have outlined, this is how we're going to get through it. You talked about the Russians, the transformation of Israeli society. Yes, maybe the election goes this way or that way within a very narrow range and a bizarre image of what the two-state solution really means. But from a political, cultural point of view, Israel's got to go through a much more fundamental transformation, in part because of the integration of hundreds of thousands of immigrants from the former Soviet Union.
We have some responses. You've provoked your colleagues. Ian, if you keep this up, we're going to start charging attendance. Go ahead.
I just wanted to respond to what Tom raised earlier about the question of the myth of U.S. vital national interest. Can you hear me? Okay. What I said or what I meant to say, if I didn't say this, then I must have misspoke, is that the myth is that it's a vital national security interest. We over-exaggerate the extent to which the United States is going to commit itself to changing the situation. And so while I do think that, a peace agreement can serve U.S. interests, it will only move, the United States will only move in that direction if other things fall into place as well. And domestic politics simply do not allow that for a variety of the reasons that we discussed. I did also want to respond to one thing that Jeremy brought up in his answer to the question about Israeli politics. I did not see the election this year as a move of Israel to the center. Actually, I saw it the exact opposite way. I saw it as a shift to the right, a stark shift to the right. And I think when you look at the breakdown and you look at the numbers, they really only point to that fact. Israeli politics is about getting to 61. And really now the only viable coalition that can get to 61 is a right-wing coalition, primarily because the non-right-wing parties, if we can call them that, do not include the Arab parties. And so by the Arab parties excluding themselves and also the Zionist parties excluding the Arab parties, the opposition can never get to 60 under the current formulation. And the parties in the opposition, like Yesh Atid, for example, is not a centrist party. If you look at their politics, they've said very little about the question of Israel's position in the West Bank and the continued occupation. And the leader of that party announced that he was running in the Israeli colony of Ariel in the West Bank. So, this is by no means a left-wing pro-peace party. The center has actually moved to the right because the right has also moved to the right. And so much so that Avigdor Lieberman today is no longer the most right-wing crazy, fascist in Israel. Now he's part of the more mainstream right of Likud. So I think that it's actually gone in a much more difficult direction than the one that Jeremy had characterized. No.
So just a few points of, I'm sure it will provide time for discussion over the next half hour or so on many of these points. The question of what is possible. I understand the difficulties. I understand the costs. But what I don't hear from Ian and I don't hear from folks who put forward the one-state scenario is the road that they would pursue. And I think Ahmad made that point as well, that it is really, really hard to see how Martin Indyk and John Kerry are going to be successful over the next couple of years. I admit that. The odds of success are probably not 100%. I don't know if anybody in this room thinks they're higher than 50%. Can I see a quick show of hands? Okay, so, no, my hand is not up. I'm asking the question. So let's agree that this is very, very hard to try to get a negotiation to success around the two-state formula. But to think that it would be easier to reach an agreement on a one-state outcome is, to my mind, the flight of fancy. I think it is more akin to planning the colonization of Mars than to think about how you're going to get the Israelis and the Palestinian people to sit at a table together and talk about the practicalities of arranging an equitable, just, one-state future together. So given that, I understand Martin Indyk trying to inject a sense of urgency and saying the window will close. I think the window closes on this round of efforts. I don't know that President Abbas has another go in him at age 78. I don't know whether or not another American Secretary of State will come along like John Kerry for quite some time, who's going to do what he did to get this back in gear. It's going to be a while. I do know that the next decade, the next generation will be really, really ugly if we don't succeed. It's going to be very painful for all of my friends on both sides of the line. And I predict, and I hope I'm young enough to see this, that one day we'll come back to the two-state solution. After this window closes, if we fail, and I pray to God we don't fail, but if it fails and we go through all that pain and all that suffering, ultimately everybody will come back to the table and say, how do we divide this land? Where's the border? How do we figure out Jerusalem? How do we meet the needs of the refugees? How do we figure out security? We'll be right back in the place we're at, because there isn't. You talk about plausibility of the two-state solution. Give me one scenario of a plausible future that is agreed upon and how you get there in our lifetimes for achieving this fanciful vision. And then we can talk about plausibility. I have one other thing to say, which is about Tzachi Hanegbi and those on the right. My father was a commander in the Irgun. My father was a comrade in arms with Tzipi Livni's father, with Dan Meridor's father, the parents of many of the leaders of Israel's right today. I understand the right-wing mentality too. I grew up in it. I defended it. But there comes a point, and it has for Dan Meridor, it has for Tzipi Livni, it has for Tzachi Hanegbi, when you realize that the only way to ensure the thing that does matter to all of us, which is the survival of a national Jewish home, is some form of compromise. You can't have it all. And that recognition from the center right is the single most important reason for optimism that there is a hope, because the confluence of Israelis saying it is in our national self-interest and knowing that Palestinians believe it is in their national self-interest, that this is the way to fulfill their national aspirations, that is where the hope lies. As long as there are people on the center right in Israeli politics willing to stand up and say that and work towards that end, they need to be embraced and not scorned.
Well, I do have questions from the floor I'd like to get to, but my second question was, if the two-state solution is impossible or will be impossible in a year, what needs to be done to avoid an apartheid state or a bloody revolution, and how long will it take, and how will we get to equal rights for everybody?
At this point, we can't avoid an apartheid state because we have one. And I would argue that we've had one since 1948. I don't think it's been about 1967. An apartheid state, by definition, is a state that uses systematic human rights abuses to empower a particular demography based on race or ethnicity or what have you. I think that's been the case since the creation of the State of Israel, by virtue of its denial of allowing refugees to return to their homes. It's used systematic abuse of human rights to maintain a particular demography as an empowered majority. That continued to be the case in 1967. That continues to be the case today. The system has only become more and more complex. And I think there's only one way to change that. And as I said in my remarks in the beginning, it requires massive pressure on the state to change its behavior. You cannot convince Israel that it should end the occupation by trying some reverse psychology about it being in its abstract interest years down the line when they see that they can very well maintain this today. They can maintain it. They are maintaining it. They've been maintaining it. Perpetual occupation has been a viable policy option in Israel and continues to be. Until that calculus changes on the Israeli end, nothing else is going to change. You know, it's funny, about 20 years ago, shortly after Yitzhak Shamir lost election, he was interviewed by a newspaper, and he said, you know, if it was up to me, I would have negotiated autonomy with the Palestinians for 20 years, and by that point, we would have had 500,000 settlers in the West Bank.
All right, I'd like to take some of these questions from the floor, and some of them are for Jeremy. I'm going to try to combine them. Here's one. Netanyahu has set conditions for an agreement with the Palestinians. Number one, no return to the 1967 borders, which he considers indefensible. No return of the Palestinians of 1948 and their children, that's the refugees in the diaspora, and their children and grandchildren. And number three, Israel has to maintain a military presence on the borders of the Jordan Valley. Given those positions, how are you going to get to a two-state solution? And then there's another one that has been introduced in the last 2 years or so, in which Netanyahu has asked the Palestinians to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, which that's new. And then there are a number of questions here about the concrete facts on the ground. Here's one. There are 30+ Israeli laws that institutionalize discrimination against Palestinian citizens of Israel. Oh, this is Palestinian citizens of Israel, including laws regarding to land acquisition. Will you go on record as opposing these? And if so, what are you and J Street doing to oppose them? And all right, that's 3 that are combined. Can you take them?
Happy to. Let me begin because I must respond, Yousef. I can't sit here, of course, and accept and leave hanging the notion that by definition Israel, since 1948, has been an apartheid state. I, of course, do not agree. I would share with former prime ministers Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert my very, very deep concern about the future and where Israel heads if there isn't a two-state solution, and what happens in a society in which potentially a minority of Jewish residents and citizens have rights that a majority of non-Jewish residents and citizens don't have. That apartheid word has been used by Prime Ministers Olmert and Barak as a potential for where Israel is headed. To me, the national home of the Jewish people must be a state rooted in justice, rooted in treating people equally, and if that is the future, then we have lost Zionism. Then we have lost what it means to have an Israel. And so, yes, that is a national interest to me, is avoiding that future. But I don't buy that the very definition of Israel is that. I think there is a way to square being Jewish in character and being democratic in nature. In answer to the question about do we speak out about the injustices to those within Israel who do not receive, as citizens of the State of Israel, equal treatment of the law. We do speak out on that. It's not our mission. There's an organization called the New Israel Fund that I used to work for, that is their mission. I'm a supporter of the New Israel Fund to ensure that those rights are upheld, equal rights. And I said it in my opening remarks, that the Israel that I want to fight for, and the majority of Jews around the world want to fight for, is one that upholds those rights. So absolutely, that is of deep concern. On the question of Bibi Netanyahu's conditions, what I would say is we're in negotiations. Thank goodness we got past the notion of preconditions. What the questioner articulated, borders, refugees, the question of the recognition of the character of the State of Israel, those are the topics of the negotiations. They are no longer preconditions because they are now subject to negotiation. And I think we're all familiar with, let's say, the Model Geneva Accords. We're all familiar with the Clinton parameters. We're all familiar with the ideas that are out there about how to reach a resolution on those topics. The border between these two states ultimately will hew, if there is to be an agreement, will hew relatively closely to the 1967 lines. But we all know it won't be the 1967 lines. There will be swaps. The Arab League accepted that in May. It is United States policy under this president, and it's the common sense end to this conflict. So yes, the 1967 lines precisely will not be the border, but there will be a pretty close adherence to it, give or take a few percent, and there'll be swaps. The issue of Israel's security is a sine qua non. There won't be an agreement if there isn't a set of security arrangements that the security establishment of the State of Israel doesn't believe is sufficient. General John Allen, on behalf of the United States government, is now engaged in a separate track of negotiations with the Israelis to review every single security concern that Israel has placed on the table and to try to develop an assurance from the United States that those security needs can be met. The question of an Israeli military presence on the Jordan River is one potentially of time. Somebody said 30 years has been put out there. Other people have said 0 years. So somewhere between 0 and 30 lies a compromise that perhaps can save generations of suffering. I would hope that my friends on the Palestinian side can see that conceding some limited time presence with clear markers over that time of performance, with a gradual withdrawal of Israeli security presence, is a potential way to resolve this. That is called a compromise. And I hope we are heading in that direction. As far as the Jewish state issue, it allows me to tie back to the question of Yair Lapid and calling him a right-wing politician. It was just reported in the papers this morning, and so folks on the panel may have missed it. Yair Lapid repeated what Menachem Begin said about the need for others to recognize the nature of the State of Israel. And I share this very, very deeply. The State of Israel doesn't need anyone's permission or recognition to be the national home of the Jewish people. It is up to Israel to determine its character. Israel didn't
Pound arm wrestler. You'd love to invite back to the table a 97-pound weakling every single time. A 600-pound guy sitting, in your corner, speaking all about how he used the idea, the pretext of security to scuttle the negotiation.
Outcome we might have one, but not via negotiations. I certainly say the same thing about one state. But is that unusual? Try to think of a national